The dust kicked up from the wagon wheels hung in the air like a golden cloud, caught by the late afternoon sun that painted the Texas plains in shades of amber and rust. Samuel McKinnon pulled his hat lower over his weathered face, squinting against the glare as he guided his horses toward the small trading post that sat like a lonely island in the vast ocean of grassland. The wooden building looked tired, its paint peeling and its porch sagging under the weight of too many seasons, but it was the only sign of civilization he'd seen in 3 days of hard riding. The sound of voices carried on the wind as he approached, and Samuel's jaw tightened when he recognized the harsh laughter of men engaged in business he wanted no part of. But his supplies were running low, and the nearest town was another 2 days' ride. He had little choice but to stop, though every instinct told him to keep moving. As he tied his horses to the hitching post, Samuel could see through the open doorway into the dim interior of the trading post. A group of men stood in a rough circle, their attention focused on something in the center that he couldn't quite make out. The smell of unwashed bodies, whiskey, and tobacco smoke drifted out to greet him, along with words that made his stomach turn. "She's a fine specimen," one of the men was saying, his voice thick with drink and cruel amusement. "Look at them eyes. Got fight in her, this one does. That'll make her worth more to the right buyer." Samuel's hand instinctively moved to the pistol at his hip as he stepped through the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. In the center of the circle stood a young Comanche woman, her hands bound with rope, her dark eyes blazing with defiance despite her circumstances. She couldn't have been more than 20, with long black hair that fell past her shoulders and skin the color of burnished copper. Her traditional dress was torn and dirty, evidence of rough treatment, but she held herself with a dignity that seemed to burn brighter in the face of her captor's cruelty. $50 for her, called out a man with a scraggly beard and clothes that hadn't seen soap in months. "She'd make a fine worker for my ranch." The woman's eyes found Samuel's across the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He saw in her gaze not the broken spirit of a captive, but the fierce pride of someone who had not surrendered, who would not surrender. There was intelligence there, too, and a pain so deep it made his chest ache just to witness it. 60, came another voice, and Samuel turned to see a well-dressed man with soft hands and cruel eyes. "I could use her in my house. Train her proper, you know." The implications in the man's tone made Samuel's hands ball into fists. He'd seen enough of the world to know what fate awaited this woman, and every fiber of his being rebelled against it. He thought of his own sister, taken by raiders when he was barely old enough to understand what that meant, never to be seen again. The memory was a knife that never dulled, and seeing this woman bound and helpless brought all that old pain rushing back. 75. The bearded man countered, his eyes gleaming with avarice. Samuel found himself stepping forward before he'd fully decided to act. $100, he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Gold." The sudden silence that followed his words was deafening. Every eye in the room turned to him, sizing him up, trying to determine if he was serious. Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, the weight of it heavy in his hand. It represented most of his savings, money he planned to use to buy land and start fresh somewhere new. But looking at the woman's face, at the flash of something that might have been hope quickly suppressed, he knew he couldn't walk away. 100 in gold, he repeated, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "Right here, right now." The trader who seemed to be running the auction, a greasy man with yellowed teeth, rubbed his hands together greedily. "Well now, that's a serious offer. Anyone want to top it?" The bearded man started to speak, but his companion elbowed him hard in the ribs and whispered something that made him close his mouth with a snap. The well-dressed man looked like he was considering it, but after a long moment, he shook his head and stepped back. "Sold, then," the trader announced with obvious satisfaction. $100 in gold it is. Samuel counted out the coins with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will. Each piece of gold that left his fingers felt like a piece of his future, but he didn't hesitate. When the last coin hit the trader's palm, the man bit down on it to test its authenticity, then nodded with approval. "She's yours, mister. What you do with her ain't none of our concern." The casual dismissal in the man's voice made Samuel's jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain calm. He approached the Comanche woman slowly, aware that sudden movements might frighten her. though she showed no signs of fear. If anything, she looked more puzzled than afraid, her dark eyes studying his face as if trying to read his intentions. "I'm going to cut your bonds," Samuel said quietly, pulling his knife from its sheath. "I won't hurt you." She said nothing, but she didn't flinch when he reached for the ropes around her wrists. The knife was sharp, and the bonds fell away with a few careful strokes. She rubbed her wrists where the rope had chafed the skin, her eyes never leaving his face. "You pay gold for me, stranger," she said, her English accented but clear. "But about no coin." Her voice was like music played on a minor key, beautiful but tinged with sadness and steel. Samuel felt something shift inside his chest at the sound of it, at the quiet dignity in her words, even in these circumstances. "I don't expect you to bow," he replied, sliding the knife back into its sheath. "What's your name?" She hesitated for a long moment, clearly debating whether to answer. "Iona," she said finally. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "Samuel McKinnon," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "And I want you to know, you're free to go wherever you wish. I didn't buy you to own you." Confusion flickered across her features, followed quickly by suspicion. "Then, why did you give him gold?" It was a fair question, and one Samuel wasn't entirely sure he could answer. "Because I couldn't let them sell you to someone who would hurt you," he said after a moment. "I've seen enough of that kind of evil in this world." Iona studied his face for a long time, her dark eyes searching for any sign of deception. Around them, the other men in the trading post had returned to their own business, though Samuel could feel their curious glances. The trader was already counting his gold, probably planning how to spend it. "My people are dead," Iona said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Soldiers came to our camp 3 days ago. They said we had stolen horses, but we had stolen nothing. There was fighting and fire and screaming. I woke up with blood on my head and strange men putting ropes on my hands." The pain in her voice was raw and fresh, and Samuel felt it like a physical blow. He'd heard too many stories like this one, seen too much of what happened when worlds collided with violence and misunderstanding. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "I'm truly sorry for your loss." She nodded once, sharply, as if accepting his sympathy, but not wanting to dwell on it. "These men, they brought me here to sell like a horse or a cow. But you—" She paused, her head tilting slightly as she studied him. "You are different. Why?" Samuel thought about that question, about the sister he'd lost, and the guilt he'd carried ever since. About all the times he'd walked away from injustice because it wasn't his fight, because getting involved would only bring trouble. But looking at this woman, this Iona, whose name meant eternal blossom, he couldn't find it in himself to walk away. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. She laughed then, but there was no humor in it. "Right thing? What does a white man know about right things? Your people take our land, kill our buffalo, break every promise they make. And now you speak to me of right things?" Her words stung because they held truth, and Samuel couldn't deny that. He'd seen enough of frontier life to know that justice was often a luxury that only the strong could afford, and that his people had not always been just in their dealings with hers. "You're right," he admitted. "My people have done terrible things to yours. I can't speak for all of them, and I can't undo what's been done. But I can speak for myself, and I can tell you that what happened to you was wrong. What they were going to do to you was wrong. And I couldn't stand by and let it happen." Iona was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant, as if she was seeing something far away. "My grandmother used to say that the heart of a person could be seen in their actions when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain. You gave gold for a stranger's freedom. Perhaps there is something in your words." "I hope so," Samuel said. "What will you do now? Do you have family somewhere? Other people you can go to?" The question seemed to pain her, and she looked away toward the open door and the endless plains beyond. "My family is with the spirits now. My people are scattered like seeds on the wind. I have nowhere to go, no one to go to." The loneliness in her voice was heartbreaking, and Samuel found himself wanting to offer her something, some hope or comfort. But what could he give her? He was just one man with a wagon and a few horses, traveling to nowhere in particular himself. "You could come with me," he heard himself saying, and was surprised by his own words. "At least until you decide what you want to do. I'm not looking to hire you or own you or anything like that. Just nobody should have to face the world alone." She turned back to him, her eyes wide with surprise. You would travel with a Comanche woman? Your people would not understand. My people, Samuel said with a bitter smile, aren't exactly lining up to be my friends anyway. I keep to myself mostly. And what they understand or don't understand isn't really my concern. Ayanna was quiet again, thinking. Samuel could see the wheels turning in her mind, weighing options that probably all seemed bad in their own way. A woman alone on the frontier, especially a native woman, faced dangers that made traveling with a strange white man seem like the better choice. What do you want from me in return? She asked finally. Nothing, Samuel said. Maybe some company on the trail. Maybe someone to talk to who isn't my horses. But nothing you don't want to give. She studied his face one more time, and Samuel tried to keep his expression open and honest. Whatever she decided, he would respect it. He'd given her back her freedom, and that meant the freedom to choose her own path, even if that path led away from him. I will come with you, she said at last. But I make my own choices. I am not your woman, not your servant, not your possession. The gold you paid does not make me yours. Understood, Samuel said, relief flooding through him. We're traveling companions, nothing more. Partners, maybe if you're willing. For the first time since he'd seen her, something that might have been a smile ghosted across Ayanna's lips. It was gone almost before he could be sure he'd seen it, but it left him feeling lighter somehow. Partners, she repeated, as if testing the word. Yes, I think I can accept that. Samuel nodded toward the door. My wagon's outside. We should probably get moving before dark. There's a stream about 5 miles north where we can camp for the night. Ayanna followed him out into the afternoon sun, and Samuel was aware of the curious and sometimes hostile stares of the men they passed. He kept his hand near his gun and his body positioned between Ayanna and anyone who might think to cause trouble. But they made it to his wagon without incident. As Samuel checked his horses and prepared to leave, he found himself stealing glances at his new traveling companion. She stood beside the wagon with an easy grace, her eyes constantly moving, taking in everything around her with the alertness of someone who had learned to read danger in every shadow. Despite everything she had been through, she held herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Ready? Samuel asked, offering her his hand to help her up into the wagon. She looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then placed her own in it. Her skin was warm and callous from work, and Samuel felt a strange little jolt at the contact. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they rode away from the trading post, Samuel found himself thinking about the strange turn his day had taken. This morning he'd been just another traveler making his way across the plains. Now he was traveling with a Comanche woman who challenged everything he thought he knew about courage and dignity. He wasn't sure what the future held for either of them, but for the first time in a long while, he was curious to find out. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Beside him, Ayanna sat in silence, her face turned toward the setting sun. Samuel wondered what she was thinking, what memories of her lost family might be playing through her mind. He wanted to say something comforting, but he'd learned that sometimes the best comfort was simply presence, simply not being alone. Tell me about your horses, Ayanna said suddenly, breaking the silence. Samuel looked down at his team, 2 sturdy bays that had carried him faithfully across hundreds of miles. Not much to tell, he said. The one on the left is Buck, the one on the right is Belle. They're good animals, steady and strong. You speak of them with affection, Ayanna observed. That is good. Animals know when they are cared for. Do you know much about horses? Samuel asked. My people lived with horses, Ayanna said, and there was pride in her voice. We understood them, and they understood us. A warrior and his horse were as one spirit, one mind. Your Buck and Belle, they trust you. Samuel felt oddly pleased by her assessment. What about you? Did you have a horse? Pain flickered across Ayanna's face. Yes, a paint mare named Windancer. She was killed in the attack, along with everything else. The raw grief in her voice made Samuel's chest tighten. I'm sorry, he said again, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to say them anyway. Ayanna nodded, but said nothing more, and Samuel let the conversation die. Some wounds were too fresh to probe, and he sensed that talking about her lost horse was like touching a nerve that was still too tender to bear. They rode in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. The stream Samuel had mentioned appeared ahead of them, a ribbon of silver winding through the grassland, bordered by cottonwood trees that would provide shelter and wood for a fire. As Samuel guided the wagon toward the trees, he found himself thinking about the strange partnership that had formed between them. Ayana was right that his people would not understand. A white man traveling with a Comanche woman would raise eyebrows at best, and could mean serious trouble at worst. But looking at her now, seeing the quiet strength in the set of her shoulders, and the way she observed everything around them with intelligent eyes, Samuel found that he didn't care what anyone else thought. He'd done the right thing back at that trading post. For once in his life, when it mattered, he'd done the right thing. Whatever came next, he could live with that. The morning sun filtered through the cottonwood leaves and dappled patterns that danced across the small clearing where Samuel and Ayana had made their camp. Samuel woke to the sound of birds singing and the gentle murmur of the stream, feeling more rested than he had in weeks. For a moment, he lay still in his bedroll, enjoying the peaceful sounds, before the events of the previous day came rushing back to him. He sat up carefully, looking around the camp for Ayana. His heart skipped a beat when he didn't see her immediately, and for a panicked moment, he wondered if she had decided to leave during the night. Then, he spotted her by the stream, kneeling on the bank with her hands cupped in the water. She was washing her face and hands, performing what looked like a morning ritual, her movements graceful and deliberate. Samuel watched her for a moment, struck by the simple dignity of her actions. Even after everything she had been through, she maintained her routines, her sense of self. There was something beautiful about that, something that spoke to a strength of character that couldn't be broken by circumstances. "Good morning," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned at the sound of his voice, water droplets still clinging to her face. "Good morning, Samuel McKinnon," she replied, and he was surprised to hear something that might have been warmth in her voice. "Just Samuel is fine," he said, sitting up and pushing his hair back from his face. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Ayana admitted. "I thought the dreams would come, but they did not. Perhaps the sound of the water kept them away." Samuel nodded, understanding more than she probably knew. He'd had his own share of dreams that brought unwelcome visitors from the past. "Water's peaceful," he agreed. "Always has been for me, too." He stood and stretched, working the stiffness out of his back from sleeping on the ground. As he did, he became aware that Ayana was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes, and he found himself wondering what she was thinking. Did she trust him? Was she regretting her decision to come with him? "I should get a fire going," he said, partly to break the silence, and partly because they would need coffee and breakfast before they got back on the road. "Get some coffee started." "I will help," Ayana said, rising gracefully from the stream bank. "I know about fires and cooking." Together, they gathered wood and kindling from the area around their camp. Samuel was impressed by Ayana's efficiency and knowledge. She seemed to know instinctively which wood would burn best, which pieces would give off the most heat, and how to arrange them for maximum effectiveness. When he commented on her skill, she gave him a look that was both amused and slightly exasperated. "My people have been making fires for longer than yours have known this land exists," she said. "We learn from necessity, not from books." Samuel felt his face warm at the gentle rebuke. "You're right," he said. "I suppose I still have a lot to learn about a lot of things." Something in his tone must have softened her attitude toward him, because when she spoke again, her voice was less sharp. "We all have things to learn. The wise person admits what they do not know." As the fire caught and began to burn steadily, Samuel set about preparing breakfast. He had bacon, beans, and hardtack in his supplies, simple food but filling. He offered to share everything with Ayana, half expecting her to refuse out of pride, but she accepted graciously. "This is good," she said after taking a bite of the bacon. "Salty but good. Not exactly what you're used to, I imagine," Samuel said. "No," Ayana agreed. "My people ate buffalo, deer, wild plants, and berries. Food that came from the land, not from cans and boxes. But this will do." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Samuel found himself stealing glances at his companion, trying to understand the complex woman who had so unexpectedly become part of his journey. She had a quality of stillness about her that he found both calming and mysterious. Even when she was eating or tending the fire, there was a sense that she was completely present in the moment, not distracted by thoughts of what had been or what might come. "Where were you going?" Ayana asked suddenly, breaking into his thoughts. "Before yesterday. Where was your journey taking you?" Samuel considered the question. "West," he said finally, Maybe California, maybe Oregon. Somewhere new, somewhere I could start fresh. What are you starting fresh from? The question was direct, and Samuel found himself appreciating her straightforward approach. There was no dancing around subjects with Ayanna, no polite small talk that meant nothing. She asked what she wanted to know. The war, he said after a moment. I came back from a war, and everything was different. My family's farm was gone, sold for taxes. My parents dead from fever. The woman I thought I'd marry had married someone else. There wasn't anything left for me there, so I decided to head west and see what I could make of myself. Ayanna nodded slowly. War changes everything, she said quietly. It takes away the world you knew and leaves you in a place that looks the same but feels different. You understand that, Samuel observed. It wasn't a question. My people have been at war for as long as I can remember, Ayanna said. Not the kind of war your people fight with armies and uniforms, but war nonetheless. Fighting for our land, our way of life, our children's future. I have seen many things change, many people lost. She paused, staring into the fire. But what happened 3 days ago, that was different. That was the end of everything. The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, and Samuel felt the urge to reach out to her to offer some kind of comfort. But he sensed that she was not ready for such gestures, that her grief was still too fresh and too private for sympathy from a stranger, even a well-meaning one. Tell me about California, she said suddenly, changing the subject with the same directness she'd shown before. What do you expect to find there? Samuel was grateful for the change of topic, sensing that she needed to move away from painful memories. Land, he said. Good soil, mild weather, opportunities for a man willing to work hard. I've heard there are places where you can grow crops year-round, where a small farm can support a family. You want a family? Ayanna asked, and there was something unreadable in her voice. Someday, maybe, Samuel admitted. I always thought I would. But that was before everything changed. Now I'm not sure what I want, except to find a place where I can be useful, where I can build something worthwhile. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Building something worthwhile, she repeated. That is a good goal. But what makes something worthwhile? It was a deeper question than Samuel had expected, and he found himself thinking carefully before answering. I suppose making things better than they were when you found them. Leaving something good behind when you're gone. And if the thing you build is taken away, if everything you create is destroyed by others, was it still worthwhile? Samuel looked at her sharply, hearing the echo of her own recent losses in the question. Yes, he said after a moment. Yes, I think it still was. Because the building itself has value, even if what you build doesn't last. The effort, the intention, the care you put into it, that matters. Ayanna met his eyes across the fire, and for a moment something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. She was not just asking about building in general. She was asking whether her people's entire way of life, now destroyed, had been worthwhile. Whether the love and effort they had put into their families, their traditions, their relationship with the land, meant anything if it could all be swept away so easily. My grandmother built beautiful baskets, Ayanna said quietly. She taught me to weave them when I was small. They were not just containers for carrying things. They were art, prayer, history. Each pattern told a story, carried meaning passed down from grandmother to granddaughter for generations. What happened to them? Samuel asked gently. Burned, Ayanna said simply. All of them, along with everything else. But, she paused, her fingers moving as if weaving invisible patterns in the air. I still remember how to make them. I still carry the stories in my head, the meanings in my hands. They destroyed the baskets, but they could not destroy what my grandmother taught me. Samuel nodded slowly, beginning to understand. So the building was worthwhile, even though they took away what was built. Perhaps, Ayanna said. I am still learning to believe that. They finished their breakfast in thoughtful silence, each processing the weight of the conversation they had just shared. Samuel found himself moved by Ayanna's strength, by her willingness to search for meaning even in the face of overwhelming loss. He also found himself thinking about his own journey, about what he was really seeking as he traveled west. As they prepared to break camp and continue their journey, Samuel noticed that Ayanna moved with practiced efficiency, rolling her blanket and gathering her few possessions with quick, sure movements. She had clearly done this many times before, probably during her people's seasonal migrations. There was a nomadic grace to her actions that spoke of a life lived in harmony with movement and change. "How far do you travel in a day?" she asked as Samuel hitched his horses to the wagon. "Depends on the terrain and the weather," he replied. "Maybe 20, 25 miles on a good day." "Why? I'm used to traveling on horseback," Ayana explained. "We could cover more ground that way, but I understand that your wagon carries supplies we cannot do without." Samuel looked at his heavily loaded wagon, thinking about her words. She was right that they could make better time on horseback, but everything he owned was in that wagon. His tools, his food, his bedding, the few personal possessions that connected him to his past. The thought of abandoning it all was unsettling. "What did your people do when they needed to travel fast?" he asked. "We took only what we could not live without," Ayana said. "The rest, we left behind or came back for later. But your people, you carry your whole lives with you. That must be heavy." Her observation struck him more deeply than she probably intended. He did carry his whole life with him, but what kind of life was it? A collection of objects, memories of things that were gone, preparations for a future that might never come. We looked at it that way. It did seem heavy. "Maybe I could leave some things behind," he said slowly. "Keep only what's really necessary." Ayana studied his face carefully. "That is your choice to make. I am in no hurry to reach anywhere. I have nowhere to be." The sadness in that last statement made Samuel's chest tight. Here was a woman who had lost everything: family, home, community, future, and yet she was offering to accommodate his pace, his needs. The generosity of it humbled him. "We'll stick with the wagon for now," he decided. "But maybe we can find ways to travel more efficiently." They climbed up onto the wagon seat, and Samuel guided the horses back toward the main trail that led west. The morning was clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the smell of wildflowers and new grass. It should have been a perfect day for traveling, but Samuel found himself thinking about the conversation they'd had over breakfast about building things and losing them and finding meaning in the attempt itself. "Ayana," he said after they'd been riding for a while, "yesterday, you said you bowed a no coin. What did you mean by that?" She was quiet for a moment, and Samuel wondered if she would answer. When she did speak, her voice was thoughtful. "My grandmother used to say that every person has something inside them that cannot be bought or sold, something that belongs only to themselves. The traders back there, they thought they owned me because they had papers that said so. The men who bid on me, they thought gold could make me theirs. But the thing inside me, the part that is truly me, that can never belong to anyone else. Even though I paid for your freedom?" "You paid for my release from their ropes," Ayana said. "But my freedom was never theirs to sell. You gave me back my ability to choose, but the freedom itself was always mine." Samuel nodded slowly, beginning to understand the distinction she was making. "And you chose to come with me. I chose to travel in the same direction as you," Ayana corrected gently. "That is not the same thing as belonging to you or following you. I make my own path, even when it runs alongside yours." The independence in her voice was absolute, and Samuel found himself both intimidated and impressed by it. He'd never met anyone, man or woman, who carried such complete ownership of themselves. Even in her current circumstances, displaced and alone, she maintained a sovereignty that couldn't be touched by external forces. "I respect that," he said. "And I want you to know, if our paths need to separate at some point, I'll understand. And if your path needs to change direction because of mine, will you resent it?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I'm Comanche," Ayana said simply. "Traveling with me will bring you trouble from your people. Some will not understand. Others will be hostile. Your journey will be harder because of my presence." Samuel had thought about this, of course. She was right that there would be people who wouldn't understand, who would see a white man traveling with a native woman and draw their own conclusions. There might be places they couldn't go together, people who wouldn't do business with him, confrontations he'd rather avoid. "Let me worry about my people," he said finally. "I made my choice yesterday, and I'm making it again today. If there's trouble, we'll face it together." Ayana turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "You were very certain for a man who met me yesterday. Some things you know right away," Samuel said. "And some choices are easy, even when they're hard." They rode on through the morning, the wagon wheels turning steadily beneath them and the horses settling into the rhythm of long travel. Samuel found himself hyper-aware of Ayana's presence beside him, the way she sat straight-backed and alert, the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the way she seemed to be listening to sounds he couldn't hear. "What do you see out there?" he asked after noticing her studying something in the distance. "Dust," she said. "Riders, maybe 6 or 7 miles south. Moving fast." Samuel squinted in the direction she was looking, but couldn't make out anything unusual. "How can you tell?" "Practice," Iana said. "When you live on the plains, you learn to see what matters for survival. Dust clouds tell you about weather, about buffalo herds, about people approaching. The size, the direction, the speed, they all mean something. Are these riders something to worry about?" Iana watched for another moment before shaking her head. "They're moving away from us, and fast. Probably nothing to do with us. But it is good to know they are there." Samuel marveled at her ability to read signs he couldn't even see. It made him acutely aware of how much he still had to learn about surviving in this landscape. He thought he was reasonably competent at frontier travel, but compared to Iana's knowledge, he felt like a greenhorn tourist. "Would you teach me?" he asked impulsively. "How to read the signs, I mean. How to see what you see." Iana looked surprised by the request. "You want to learn Comanche skills?" "I want to learn survival skills," Samuel said. "Doesn't matter where they come from. Out here, knowledge is knowledge." A small smile ghosted across Iana's lips, the first genuine one Samuel had seen from her. "Very well," she said. "I will teach you what I can. But you must be a good student. These things take practice and patience." "I can be patient," Samuel said, and realized as he said it that it was true. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't in a hurry to get somewhere else. The journey itself was becoming more interesting than the destination. As they traveled, Iana began pointing out things Samuel had never noticed before. The way certain grasses bent indicated the prevailing wind direction. The flight patterns of birds could tell you about water sources or approaching weather. Animal tracks crossing the trail revealed what creatures had passed this way and how recently. "Everything is connected," Iana explained as she showed him how to read the subtle signs of rabbit burrows in the grass. "The land, the animals, the weather, the people, we are all part of one great web. When you learn to see the connections, you can understand much more than what is right in front of you." Samuel found himself fascinated by this way of viewing the world. It was so different from his own background, where knowledge came from books and formal education, where understanding meant breaking things down into separate parts rather than seeing them as interconnected wholes. "How did you learn all this?" he asked. "From my grandmother, from my mother, from watching and listening and making mistakes," Iana said. "Knowledge was shared freely in my tribe. Everyone taught everyone, because survival depended on all of us knowing what we needed to know." "That sounds like a good way to live," Samuel said, and meant it. "It was," Iana said quietly, and the past tense hung heavy in the air between them. They were passing through an area where the grass grew thicker and greener, indicating underground water sources, when Samuel noticed something else that made him uneasy. The trail ahead showed signs of heavy recent use: wagon ruts, horse hooves, and what looked like the marks of many people on foot. "A lot of traffic through here lately," he observed. Iana had noticed too, and she was frowning as she studied the marks in the earth. "Not just traffic," she said slowly. "This looks like many people moving together, but not by choice." Samuel's stomach dropped as he understood what she was implying. "You think it's a group being moved against their will?" "The pattern is wrong for willing travelers," Iana said. "See how the footmarks cluster together, how there are no individual paths breaking away. And here," she pointed to marks in the dirt. "Chains. People were chained together." The realization hit Samuel like a physical blow. They were following the trail of a slave coffle, a group of people being transported to markets in the south and west. It was legal in some territories, though not others, and the sight of the evidence made him feel sick. "How long ago?" he asked. Iana studied the tracks more carefully. "Yesterday, maybe early this morning. The edges are still sharp, but there's been some wind." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. If they continued on this trail, they might overtake the group, and that could mean trouble of the worst kind. Men involved in the slave trade were often violent and desperate, and they wouldn't welcome witnesses to their activities. "We should leave the main trail," he said. "Find another route west." But Iana was still studying the tracks, her face grim. "Samuel," she said quietly, "some of these footprints, they're small. Children's feet." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Bad as it was to think of adults being transported in chains, the idea of children suffering that fate was almost unbearable. Samuel found himself thinking of his lost sister again, wondering if she had ever been forced to march in chains like this, wondering what had become of her. "There's nothing we can do," he said, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. "We're just two people against who knows how many." Ayana looked at him with those dark, penetrating eyes. "You paid gold for one person's freedom yesterday. You said it was the right thing to do." "That was different," Samuel protested. "That was one person, and I could afford the price. This could get us both killed." "Yes," Ayana agreed calmly. "It could, but children are marching in chains ahead of us. Does that not matter because helping them is dangerous?" Samuel stared at her, seeing the challenge in her eyes, and knowing she was right. He'd told himself yesterday that he couldn't stand by and watch injustice happen. But when the stakes got higher, when the risk got greater, was he prepared to retreat into the safety of inaction? "What do you think we could do?" he asked finally. "I do not know yet," Ayana admitted. "But we could follow them, see what the situation is, see if there are opportunities to help. Not all fights are won with guns and violence. Sometimes wisdom and patience can find another way." Samuel felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to turn off the main trail and avoid any contact with the slave traders. But, looking at Ayana, seeing the quiet determination in her face, he knew he couldn't choose safety while children suffered just ahead of them. "All right," he said, the words coming out before he'd fully decided to speak them. "We'll follow them, see what we can learn. But we stay well back, and we're careful. If it looks too dangerous, we back off." Ayana nodded. "Agreed. But, Samuel, whatever we find ahead, we cannot simply witness it and do nothing. Some things demand action, regardless of the cost." As Samuel guided the wagon forward along the trail marked by suffering, he found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Yesterday, he'd been a simple traveler heading west. Today he was traveling with a Comanche woman whose sense of justice seemed to burn as bright and uncompromising as a prairie fire. He wasn't sure where this path would lead them, but he was beginning to understand that with Ayana as his companion, it would never be simple or safe. The trail stretched ahead of them, marked with the signs of human bondage, and Samuel urged his horses forward into whatever waited beyond the next hill. The sun had climbed to its peak when Samuel and Ayana first caught sight of the slave caravan in the distance. They had been following the trail for hours, keeping well back, and moving carefully to avoid being spotted. Now, cresting a low hill, they could see the grim procession spread out across the valley below them like a dark stain on the golden grassland. Samuel pulled his horses to a halt behind a cluster of boulders that would hide their wagon from view. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the spyglass in his pack, and when he raised it to his eye, the sight that greeted him made his stomach turn. There were perhaps 30 people chained together in a long line, walking slowly through the grass under the watchful eyes of 6 armed guards on horseback. Men, women, and children of various ages moved with the shuffling gait of those who had walked too far for too long. Their clothes were ragged, their faces marked by exhaustion and despair. At the front of the line, a wagon carried supplies and what looked like the guards' personal belongings. "Let me see," Ayana said quietly, and Samuel handed her the spyglass. She studied the scene below for a long moment, her face growing harder with each second. When she finally lowered the glass, her eyes were blazing with controlled fury. "Families," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "They're keeping families together, but only barely. That woman there, with the 2 small children. See how she keeps looking back to make sure they're still there? And that old man at the end of the line, he can barely walk. They will not let him stop." Samuel took the spyglass back and looked again. Now that Ayana had pointed them out, he could see the family groups she meant. A woman with children who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. An elderly man stumbling with every step. Young men whose faces showed the hollow look of those who had given up hope. "Where do you think they're taking them?" Samuel asked. "South," Ayana said with certainty. "To the markets in Texas, maybe further. Some will be sold to plantations, others to work in mines or build railroads. The children," she paused, her jaw clenching. "The children will be separated from their families, sold to whoever will pay." The matter-of-fact way she spoke of these horrors made them even more chilling. Samuel lowered the spyglass and looked at his companion, seeing the pain in her dark eyes and understanding that she was thinking of her own lost family, her own children who would never grow up now. "We can't take on 6 armed men," Samuel said, though the words felt like a betrayal, even as he spoke them. No, Ayana agreed. Not directly, but there may be other ways. Such as, Ayana was quiet for a moment, studying the caravan below with the intense focus of a hunter watching her prey. They will stop for the night, she said finally. Make camp somewhere with water and shelter. That is when people are most vulnerable, when they think they are safe. You're talking about attacking them while they sleep? I'm talking about freeing people while their captors are distracted, Ayana corrected. There is a difference. Samuel considered this. It was true that a nighttime approach would give them better odds, but it would also be incredibly dangerous. If they were caught, they would likely be killed on the spot. And even if they managed to free some of the prisoners, what then? How could 30 people, many of them weak from hunger and exhaustion, escape pursuit by armed men on horseback? Even if we could free them, he said, where would they go? How would they survive? The same way I survived, Ayana said simply. By being stronger than their circumstances. By refusing to give up. The quiet strength in her voice reminded Samuel of why he'd been so drawn to her in the first place. She had faced the complete destruction of her world and somehow emerged with her dignity and determination intact. Perhaps he was underestimating what people could endure when their freedom was at stake. What do you have in mind? He asked. Ayana pointed to the terrain ahead of the caravan. There, she said. See where the trail passes between those two hills. There's a stream that runs through there and trees for shelter. They will camp there tonight. It is the best spot for miles. Samuel raised the spyglass again and studied the area she indicated. She was right that it looked like an ideal camping spot with fresh water and natural windbreaks. So we get there first, Ayana explained. We hide the wagon and the horses somewhere safe, then we watch and wait. When they make camp, when the guards settle in for the night, we move. And do what exactly? Free as many as we can, Ayana said, starting with the children. Samuel felt a chill at the calm determination in her voice. She wasn't talking about this as a vague possibility anymore. She was making plans, real plans that would put their lives at risk. And yet, looking down at the line of chained people below, he found he couldn't bring himself to argue. It's insane, he said finally. Yes, Ayana agreed. But so is paying gold for a stranger's freedom. So is trusting a Comanche woman you had just met. Sometimes the right thing to do is insane. Samuel stared at her for a long moment, then at the caravan below, then back at her face with its expression of absolute resolve. He thought about the easy path, the safe path that would take them away from this confrontation and toward the peaceful life he'd planned in California. Then he thought about children walking in chains, about families being torn apart for profit, about his own sister whose fate he had never learned. All right, he said quietly. All right, we'll try. But we plan this carefully, and if it goes wrong, if there's no chance of success, we get out. Agreed. Agreed, Ayana said, though something in her tone suggested that her definition of no chance of success might be different from his. They spent the next hour watching the caravan's progress and planning their approach. Ayana's knowledge of the terrain was invaluable. She seemed to know every stream, every stand of trees, every fold in the land that could provide cover. By the time they finally moved out, Samuel felt as ready as he could be for what they were about to attempt. Traveling cross-country to stay ahead of the caravan was slow work, but Samuel's horses were strong and his wagon was built for rough terrain. They reached the camping spot Ayana had identified with more than an hour to spare before the slave traders would arrive. The area was even better than it had looked from a distance. A sheltered valley with a clear stream, surrounded by thick stands of cottonwood and oak that would provide excellent cover for concealment. Samuel hid the wagon in a grove of trees about half a mile from where he expected the camp to be established, then hobbled his horses where they could graze but wouldn't wander far. If things went wrong and they had to run, they would need to reach their transportation quickly. Now we wait and watch, Ayana said as they settled into a concealed position overlooking the campsite. The waiting was the hardest part. Samuel found his mind racing with doubts and second thoughts, with images of everything that could go wrong. What if they were spotted during their approach? What if the guards were more alert than they appeared? What if freeing the prisoners only led to a bloody fight that got everyone killed? Beside him, Ayana seemed calm and focused her attention completely on the task ahead. Samuel envied her that clarity of purpose. She had found something worth fighting for, something that gave meaning to the risk they were taking. He was still trying to convince himself that this wasn't just elaborate suicide. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly as they watched the sun begin to sink toward the western horizon. "Because it is right," Ayana said simply. "That's not an answer. You could have chosen to travel away from this, to leave it for someone else to worry about. Why put yourself in danger for people you don't know?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment. "When the soldiers came to my village," she said finally, "when they started shooting and burning, do you know what I wish for? I wish that someone would come help us. Someone with weapons, someone with courage, someone who would stand with us against the attackers." Samuel waited, sensing there was more to come. "No one came," Ayana continued. "We fought alone, and we died alone, and the world went on as if we had never existed. But somewhere in that wish, in that hope that help would come, I made a promise to myself. If I survived, if I ever had the chance to be the help that someone else needed, I would not turn away." The simple honesty of her words hit Samuel harder than any sermon or lecture could have. She wasn't doing this for glory or excitement or even out of anger, though he was sure anger played a part. She was doing it because she had stood in the place of those who needed help, and she knew what it felt like to wait for aid that never came. "Understand," he said, and found that he really did. "Do you?" Ayana asked, studying his face. "Then, why are you here, Samuel? What promise are you keeping?" It was a fair question, and one he had been avoiding asking himself. "My sister," he said after a moment. "Mary. She was taken by raiders when she was 12. I never found out what happened to her, never found out if she lived or died, or—" He paused, unable to finish the thought. "You think she might have walked in chains like these people?" "Maybe. Probably. I was 17 when it happened, and I thought I was so tough, so ready to take on the world. But when it mattered, when she needed me, I wasn't there. I was off playing soldier with some friends, pretending to be a man." Samuel's voice was bitter with old guilt. "So maybe this is me trying to be there for someone else's sister, someone else's daughter." Ayana nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "When the time comes to act, remember that feeling. Remember why we are here." The caravan arrived as the sun was setting, the sound of chains and tired voices drifting across the valley. Samuel and Ayana watched from their hiding place as the guards drove their prisoners into the camping area and began the process of setting up for the night. The efficiency of it was chilling. These men had clearly done this many times before. The prisoners were forced to sit in a group, while their ankle chains were secured to stakes driven deep into the ground. Guards distributed meager portions of food and water, barely enough to keep people alive. Samuel watched a young mother try to share her small portion with her crying child, and felt his resolve harden into something like steel. "See the guard rotation," Ayana whispered, pointing to the men on horseback who were positioning themselves around the perimeter of the camp. "Two will stay awake at any given time, one at each end of the camp. The others will sleep near the supply wagon." Samuel studied the layout, memorizing the positions of guards, prisoners, and equipment. "When do we move?" "Middle of the night," Ayana said. "When the guards are tired and thinking more about staying awake than about threats. We approach from the stream side. The sound of water will help mask any noise we make." They waited until full darkness had fallen and the camp had settled into its nighttime routine. Samuel could hear the quiet sounds of people trying to sleep despite their chains, the low murmur of guards talking, the occasional crackle of the campfire. His heart was pounding so hard he was amazed it couldn't be heard across the valley. "Ready?" Ayana asked. Samuel checked his pistol one more time, made sure his knife was loose in its sheath, and nodded. "Ready." They moved like shadows through the darkness, using every bit of cover the terrain provided. Ayana led the way, her knowledge of silent movement evident in every step. Samuel tried to follow her example, placing his feet carefully and avoiding anything that might make noise. The approach took nearly an hour of careful movement, but finally they were crouched in the tall grass at the edge of the camp. From here, Samuel could see the prisoners clearly, men, women, and children lying on the bare ground, some sleeping fitfully, others staring up at the stars with the hollow eyes of those who had given up hope. Ayana touched his arm and pointed toward the far end of the camp, where several children were chained together near a large oak tree. Samuel nodded his understanding. They would start there with the youngest and most vulnerable. Moving through the camp itself required even more care. Every step had to be silent, every movement calculated to avoid the attention of the guards. Samuel found himself holding his breath as they crept past sleeping prisoners, past guards who sat near the dying fire smoking and talking in low voices. When they reached the children, Samuel felt his heart break a little. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5 years old, lying curled against his older sister who was trying to protect him even in sleep. Their clothes were little more than rags, their faces dirty and marked by tears. Ayana knelt beside them and gently touched the older girl's shoulder. The child's eyes snapped open in fear, but Ayana pressed a finger to her lips and smiled reassuringly. The girl stared at her for a moment, then seemed to understand that help had finally come. Working with infinite care, Ayana and Samuel began to cut through the chains that bound the children. Samuel's knife was sharp, but the metal was thick, and cutting through it without making noise was agonizingly slow work. Every small sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. The first child was freed, then the second. Each time, Ayana would whisper instructions to them about staying quiet and staying close. The children obeyed with the desperate hope of those who suddenly saw a chance at freedom. They had freed 4 of the 6 children when disaster struck. Samuel was working on the chain that bound a boy of perhaps 10 when his knife slipped and rang against the metal stake that anchored the chain to the ground. The sound wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night it might as well have been a gunshot. "What was that?" one of the guards called out, and Samuel heard the sound of boots approaching their position. Ayana grabbed the children they had freed and pushed them toward the darkness at the edge of the camp. "Run," she whispered fiercely. "Hide in the trees by the stream. We will find you." Samuel was still working frantically to free the remaining 2 children when the guard's lantern light fell across them. Time seemed to slow as the man's eyes widened in shock, as his hand reached for his pistol, as his mouth opened to shout an alarm that would wake the entire camp. "Stop right there," the guard yelled, but Ayana was already moving. She launched herself at the man with the deadly grace of a hunting cat, her knife flashing in the lantern light. The guard tried to bring his pistol around, but Ayana was faster, her blade finding its mark before he could fire. He dropped without another sound, but his lantern crashed to the ground and shattered, sending burning oil spreading across the grass. "The camp's waking up," Samuel hissed, sawing desperately at the chains that still held 2 children. "We need to go now." But Ayana was already moving toward the next group of prisoners, her knife working to free adults who might be able to help the children escape. Samuel admired her determination, but he could see this was about to become a running battle they couldn't win. "Escape! Indians! They're freeing the slaves!" someone shouted from across the camp, and suddenly the night exploded into chaos. Guards were running toward them from all directions, pistols firing, the orange light of the growing grass fire illuminating the scene like something out of a nightmare. Samuel finally cut through the last chain and grabbed the 2 remaining children, pushing them toward the darkness where he hoped the others had found safety. "Ayana," he called, but she was 20 feet away, still working to free prisoners despite the gunfire erupting around them. A bullet whined past Samuel's ear, and he knew they were out of time. He drew his own pistol and returned fire, trying to give Ayana the cover she needed to escape. But there were too many guards, and they were closing in fast. "Go!" Ayana shouted to him. "Get the children to safety." Samuel hesitated for a crucial second, torn between saving the children and abandoning Ayana to her fate. In that moment of hesitation, he saw a guard take aim at her from close range, saw the muzzle flash as the man fired. Ayana spun and fell, blood spreading across her shirt, and Samuel felt something break inside his chest. But even as she fell, she was still cutting chains, still freeing people, her knife working even as her strength failed. "Run," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the gunfire and shouting. Samuel made the hardest choice of his life. He grabbed the freed children and ran for the darkness, his heart breaking with every step that took him away from Ayana. Behind them, the camp was in complete chaos, guards shooting at shadows, prisoners crying out in confusion, the grass fire spreading and casting dancing shadows across the scene. They made it to the trees by the stream, where the other children were waiting in terrified silence. Samuel quickly counted heads and realized they had managed to free 6 children in total, though dozens of adults remained in chains. "Is the lady coming?" one of the little girls whispered, and Samuel felt tears he hadn't shed since childhood burning in his eyes. "I don't know," he said honestly. But we have to keep moving. We have to get you all to safety. They moved through the darkness along the stream, the children following him with a trust that broke his heart. Behind them, he could still hear shouting and gunfire, could still see the orange glow of the fire against the night sky. Every step away from the camp felt like a betrayal of Ayana and the courage she had shown. But he had 6 children to protect now, 6 young lives that depended on his ability to get them to safety. And somewhere in the darkness behind them, he could only hope that Ayana was still alive, still fighting, still refusing to bow to those who thought they could own human souls. The night stretched ahead of them, filled with danger and uncertainty, but also with the possibility of freedom. Samuel pressed forward through the darkness, carrying the weight of what they had accomplished and the heavier weight of what they had lost. Samuel led the 6 freed children through the darkness for hours, following the stream bank and using every shadow and piece of cover he could find. His heart was still racing from the chaos at the camp, and his mind kept returning to the image of Ayana falling. Blood spreading across her shirt, she continued to fight for the freedom of others. The children followed him in silent trust, their small hands sometimes reaching out to touch his coat for reassurance as they stumbled through the unfamiliar terrain. The youngest child, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5, began to cry quietly as exhaustion overtook her. Samuel stopped and knelt beside her, his own heart breaking at the sight of her tear-streaked face. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked softly. "Lucy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I want my mama." "I know you do," Samuel said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "We're going to try to find her, but right now, we need to keep moving. Can you be brave for just a little longer?" Lucy nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her small hand. Samuel looked around at the other children, seeing the same exhaustion and fear reflected in all their faces. They couldn't keep going much longer without rest, but every instinct told him they needed to put more distance between themselves and their pursuers. "Is there a safe place we can stop?" asked Thomas, the 10-year-old boy Samuel had freed last. Despite his young age, he seemed to understand the gravity of their situation and had appointed himself protector of the younger children. Samuel considered their options. They needed shelter, water, and a defensive position in case they were tracked. More importantly, they needed a place where the children could rest and recover their strength. His wagon was still hidden in the grove of trees, but returning to it would be risky if the guards were conducting a search. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles upstream," Samuel said, remembering a structure he'd spotted during their earlier reconnaissance. "Used to be a way station for cattle drives. It might give us shelter for a few hours." They resumed their difficult journey, the children drawing on reserves of courage Samuel hadn't known existed. As they walked, he found himself thinking about Ayana's words about the strength people could find when their freedom was at stake. These children, despite their young age and recent trauma, were proving that strength was real. The line shack turned out to be in better condition than Samuel had hoped. It was a small log structure with a stone chimney and a roof that looked mostly intact. More importantly, it was set back from the main trail and partially concealed by a stand of pine trees. Samuel conducted a careful inspection before allowing the children inside, checking for any signs of recent use or potential danger. "We'll rest here until dawn," he told them as they settled gratefully onto the wooden floor. "Then, we'll figure out our next move." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel knew their situation was precarious. 6 children with no family, no identification, no legal status in a world that didn't recognize their right to freedom. Even if he could get them to safety, what kind of future awaited them? And how could he live with himself knowing that dozens of other prisoners, including possibly their families, remained in chains? "Mister," said Sarah, one of the older girls who appeared to be about 12. "What happened to the Indian lady? Is she—" "I don't know," Samuel admitted, the words scraping his throat raw. "She was hurt, but she's strong. Stronger than anyone I've ever met. We have to hope she's all right." But hope felt fragile in the darkness of the shack, with 6 traumatized children depending on him, and no clear plan for what came next. Samuel had never felt the weight of responsibility so heavily, had never understood how quickly good intentions could lead to impossible situations. As the children gradually fell asleep, exhaustion finally overcoming their fear, Samuel sat by the small window and kept watch. The night was quiet except for the usual sounds of insects and small animals, but he knew that silence could be deceptive. Somewhere out there, men with guns were probably searching for them, driven by the financial loss of their escaped property and the fury of having been outsmarted by a woman and a stranger. It was during these dark hours before dawn that Samuel heard it, the faint sound of someone moving carefully through the underbrush outside the shack. His hand went immediately to his pistol as he strained to identify the source of the noise. Could the guards have tracked them this far? Were they about to be surrounded? The sound came again, closer this time, and Samuel was about to wake the children when he heard a familiar voice calling softly through the darkness. "Samuel? Samuel, if you are there, answer me." Relief flooded through him so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. "Ayanna," he called back, hardly daring to believe it. "Yes. Is it safe?" Come in," Samuel said, moving quickly to open the door. Ayanna appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, moving slowly and favoring her left side where blood had soaked through her shirt. Her face was pale and drawn with pain, but her eyes were alert and determined. In her right hand, she carried a rifle Samuel didn't recognize. "You're alive," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought when I saw you fall. It takes more than one bullet to stop me," Ayanna said with a weak smile. "Though it was close. The shot went through my shoulder and out the back. Painful, but not fatal." Samuel helped her to a sitting position against the wall, trying not to jostle her injured shoulder. "How did you escape? How did you find us?" "After you left with the children, I managed to free 8 more people before the guards reorganized," Ayanna explained. "In the confusion of the fire and the darkness, some of us scattered into the woods. I stayed hidden until the search parties moved on, then followed your trail along the stream." "8 more people?" Samuel stared at her in amazement. "You freed 8 more people after being shot. Some things are more important than pain," Ayanna said simply. "Besides, I told you, I bow to no coin, and I bow to no bullet either." Samuel shook his head in wonder at her courage. Even wounded and alone, she had continued to fight, had continued to free people while he was leading the children to safety. The guilt he'd been carrying about leaving her behind began to ease slightly. "Where are the others now?" he asked. "Scattered throughout the area," Ayanna said. "Some are heading north, back toward territories where they might find other free communities. Others are going west, hoping to reach California, where slavery is illegal. A few of the older men stayed behind to harass the guards and slow down any pursuit. And the guards?" Ayanna's expression grew grim. "3 dead, including the one I killed. The others are angry and determined to recapture their property. They have sent riders in all directions, and they're offering a substantial reward for information about escaped slaves and the people who freed them." Samuel felt a chill at her words. "So we're being hunted." "Yes, but that was always going to happen once we chose to act. The question now is what we do next." Samuel looked around at the sleeping children, their young faces peaceful in sleep despite everything they had endured. "We get these children to safety. That's our first priority." "Agreed. But where is safety for children with no family, no legal standing? Even in free territories, they could be recaptured if their former owners pursue them with legal documents." It was a problem Samuel had been wrestling with since their escape. The children needed more than just physical safety. They needed legal protection, new identities, a path to a legitimate future. And that would require resources and connections he didn't have. "There are people," Ayanna said quietly, reading his thoughts. "Abolitionists, underground railroad conductors, religious groups that help escaped slaves. But reaching them safely will be difficult." "You know about the Underground Railroad?" Samuel asked, surprised. "My people traded with escaped slaves sometimes," Ayanna explained. "We understood what it meant to be hunted, to need safe passage to freedom. I learned about some of the routes, some of the people who could be trusted." Samuel felt a spark of hope for the first time since their escape. "How far would we have to travel?" "There's a Quaker settlement about 4 days' ride north of here," Ayanna said. "They have helped many people find freedom and new lives. If we could reach them." "That's a long journey with 6 children," Samuel said. "And if there are search parties looking for us, it will be dangerous," Ayanna agreed. "But staying here is also dangerous. And these children deserve a chance at a real life, not just survival." Samuel studied Ayanna's face in the dim light filtering through the window. Despite her wound and obvious pain, her resolve seemed unshaken. If anything, the night's events had only strengthened her determination to see this through to the end. Your shoulder needs medical attention, he pointed out. You're losing blood, and infection could set in. I will survive until we reach safety, Ayana said with quiet confidence. My grandmother taught me about healing herbs, and there are plants along the way that will help. But you are right that we cannot delay long. One of the children, Thomas, stirred and opened his eyes, looking around the shack in confusion before his gaze settled on Ayana. His face lit up with relief and joy. You made it, he whispered, careful not to wake the others. We thought you were dead. Not dead, Ayana assured him with a gentle smile. Just delayed. How are you feeling? How are the others? Scared, Thomas admitted, but grateful. What you and Mr. Samuel did, it was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Ayana exchanged a look with Samuel, and he could see the weight of responsibility settling on both their shoulders. These children were looking to them not just for immediate safety, but for hope of a future worth living. It was a trust that couldn't be taken lightly. Thomas, Samuel said quietly, we're going to try to get all of you to a place where you'll be safe and free. Really free, where no one can ever put chains on you again. It's going to be a hard journey, but we think it's worth the risk. What do you think? Thomas considered this seriously, his young face grave with concentration. The other children, they'll follow wherever you lead, he said finally. They trust you both completely. And me? I'd rather die free than live in chains. I think the others feel the same way. The simple courage in the boy's words reminded Samuel powerfully of Ayana herself. The same refusal to accept defeat, the same willingness to risk everything for the chance at dignity and freedom. Then, we'll leave at first light, Samuel decided. We'll need to travel carefully, stay off the main roads, but we'll head north toward the Quaker settlement. What about your wagon? Your supplies? Ayana asked. Samuel had been thinking about this. His wagon and horses were still hidden in the grove where he'd left them, but retrieving them would mean returning close to the area where the guards were conducting their search. On the other hand, traveling on foot with 6 children and a wounded woman would be almost impossible. We'll need the wagon, he said finally. Without it, we'll never make it 4 days with the children. I'll go back for it alone. If there's trouble, better that only one of us is at risk. No, Ayana said firmly. If you're captured, the children and I will be stranded. We go together or not all. You're wounded, Samuel protested. You should rest, recover your strength. And you do not know the land well enough to avoid the search parties on your own, Ayana countered. You need my knowledge of the terrain and tracking, and I need your strength to handle the wagon. We